Hey guys, it's me Arthur and you are watching Fright Lore. In this new horror narration series, I'll be narrating classic folktales and urban legends along with my own original fiction based on this topic. My other show, How to Draw Creepy Creatures, will continue to be uploaded as per usual with new episodes forthcoming. Now for today's story. The Visitor by Arthur Short. Trevor sat crouched on his bed, alone. The small space was illuminated by the dull yellow glow of his nightlight, which was plugged in next to an old dresser from which an errant t-shirt or sock protruded. Oddly shaped shadows were cast over the dirty gray carpet, cast by toys that had been neglected to be put away. The fan above rotated with an awkward groaning sound that made it difficult to sleep. There was an occasional fluttering sound as the sports poster on the wall moved in the draught. The sound of muffled voices could be heard coming through the floor, from the TV that was on downstairs. His dad had had a few beers and passed out on the couch. Trevor could hear the occasional laughter from whatever sitcom was on, making him feel just a little bit less alone. He didn't like it when his dad drank. His dad was the only adult in the house, and when he passed out, it was next to impossible to wake him. Trevor wanted to go downstairs and try to sleep on the couch next to his dad, but he knew he'd be in trouble if he did. Trevor had been afraid to sleep in his room at night, but his dad had been trying to break him of the habit of sleeping in his room. His dad had told him that he was a big boy now and that he was too old to be afraid of the dark. Trevor pulled the Avenger's comforter over his head, squeaking his eyes shut. He repeated everything his dad had told him about how there was nothing in the dark, nothing to be afraid of. He cautiously peeked over the edge of the cover, scanning the room around him. There was nothing crouched in the corner, and the chair had been propped up in front of the closet door. Under his bed he had crammed cardboard boxes full of various belongings, so there was no room for anything to hide. Satisfied for now, he reluctantly closed his eyes, trying to focus on the ambient sound of the fan. It was then that he saw something strange, a light flickering through his closed eyelids. He opened his eyes and turned to the window on his right, seeing that the flickering was from a street light outside. He got up out of bed and walked towards the window, pressing his nose against the dirty glass so that he could see. It was coming from an old street light a few houses down, which needed to be serviced. Satisfied that the eerie light had a mundane source, he brushed it off, crawling silently back into bed and closing his eyes once again. He lay there for about 10 more minutes, trying in vain to fall asleep. He tried to push the anxious thoughts out of his head, but they continued to plague his mind like a swarm of angry bees. He kicked the covers off of himself, suddenly feeling way too hot, and wrapped the sheet around himself. He cracked his eyes open, seeing that the hazy yellow light filtered through the cloth. He listened to the ticking of the clock on the wall above his bureau, which barely noticed during the day, but now seemed agonizingly loud in the otherwise silent room. Every tick seemed like a small gunshot to someone trying to fall asleep. That was when he noticed something odd. The flickering light from the broken street light was gone. He paused, curious. He slipped out of bed once again and made his way to the window. The glass was covered in a film of dust and grime, so it was hard for him to see, but from what he could see, the light had gone completely out. This was hardly a surprise, being that the city hadn't bothered sending anyone out to repair it in months. He was ready to forget about it altogether and go back to bed, when he saw the street light directly in front of it start to flicker and grow dim. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring out the window. He watched as the second street light grew duller and duller until it too winked out, shrouding the end of the block in inky blackness. Trevor felt a chill run down his spine. He found that he was more confused than alarmed. He wiped off the glass with his sleeve of his pajamas as best he could and strained to see down the end of the street. The street was empty, with only a few cars parked beside the sidewalk. There weren't even any animals out this late at night, the only sign of life outside being crickets chirping. Trevor strained to see as a third light began to flicker, which was when he noticed movement. He saw that walking in the shadows beneath the deadened streetlights was something. He stared as a pair of feet made their way down the sidewalk towards his house. The movement of its feet was the only thing about the form that Trevor could make out in the darkness. Whatever it was, moved slowly, gracefully, staying within the shadows and out of the light. Trevor wondered if it was an animal of some kind, maybe a stray dog. He stood by the window, waiting for it to get close enough to tell what it was. As it meandered its way down to his house, he began to see more details. The feet were attached to a pair of long, delicate-looking legs, which seemed unnaturally thin. As it got closer, it became clear that the figure was less like an animal and more human. It was obvious at this point that the figure was not just a person walking alone at night, but something about it seemed wrong. The figure moved in a bizarre swaying motion, seeming to almost glide rather than walk. The next streetlight began to flicker. In what little light remained, Trevor could see that the figure was tall, maybe 6 feet, and very, very thin. He strained to see in the fading light, but to him the figure seemed to be nothing more than skin pulled tightly across a skeleton, with some sort of tattered, tunic-like garment thrown over its shoulders. He couldn't make out any facial features, but even still, something about the stranger's appearance left him feeling deeply unsettled. The thought that it could just be a homeless person crossed his mind. It certainly didn't look like anyone he'd ever seen before. He watched as another streetlight went out and realized with a sinking feeling that there were only 3 more streetlights between his house and where the figure was walking. He tried to tell himself that this meant nothing and that most likely this disturbing individual would walk right past his house. This thought did little to put his mind at ease, and he found he couldn't quite tear himself away from the window just yet, his eyes still glued to the figure. It was at that moment that he heard all the crickets fall silent, like someone had just hit an off switch. Everything had gone quiet, a dead calm falling over the neighborhood. If this were not alarming enough, Trevor then noticed something about the person walking towards his house that made his stomach turn. The figure's eyes appeared to be reflecting the light, like a cat's. He could clearly see 2 bright pinpricks in the darkness, like fireflies. Panic began to set in as he watched the brilliant yellow eyes coming closer to his house. He wanted to scream, but the lump in his throat was preventing him from uttering more than a tiny squeak. He knew that even if he had screamed, his dad wouldn't have heard him. He watched as the next street light went out, the gap between him and the darkness growing smaller. The figure continued walking casually down the sidewalk, its horrible eyes illuminating its path through the dark. Suddenly, it stopped dead in its tracks. Trevor watched as it looked upward, right at his window. He stood frozen in sheer terror as he realized the thing had seen him. It cocked its head to one side curiously, almost as if it was just as surprised that he had seen it. It stood still for a few moments, as if it were deciding what to do next. After a few moments, the 2 of them were staring at each other. The thing started walking again. Trevor panicked, unsure of what to do. He scrambled back into bed, pulling the covers around himself tightly. "Go away! Go away!" he mouthed silently, tears streaking down his face. He watched in silent dread as the next streetlight went out, leaving only the one next to his house. He waited, his heart racing and the sheets drenched in sweat. He hoped, prayed that it would turn around, that it would just leave him alone. Just as he thought it might be gone, the light beside his house went out. He sat there, frozen in his bed, with his eyes locked on the window. Outside was only blackness, the only light left being the little nightlight. He watched, he waited, the seconds feeling like hours. His eyes turned towards the nightlight as the cheap little bulb began to flicker and grow dim. "No! No!" he breathed, but there was no one to hear him. The next moment the fan began to slow down as if the power were being drained from it. He heard the clock on the wall tick slower and slower and saw the hands come to a halt. A deep stillness fell over the room, like time itself had stopped. Just as the nightlight began to go out, he saw movement by the window and a pair of pale, thin hands with dirty yellow nails grasped the sill. He opened his mouth to scream, but no success, a rasping wheeze escaping his lips. It was then that the room went black, the light finally dying. Moonlight streamed through his window, and he could now make out the dark silhouette of an emaciated human form, with an enlarged, hairless head and pointed ears, climbing onto the windowsill. His room was on the 2nd floor, and yet somehow this thing had managed to climb the exterior of the house using only its bare hands. The thing peered into his bedroom, pressing its long, bony hands against the glass. Trevor took comfort in the fact that his window was locked, but his sense of security didn't last long. He watched in dread and disbelief as the latch on his window began to slowly move by itself, followed by the window slowly opening before the creature. An icy cold breeze came in from outside as the god-awful thing extended one of its long, jagged nails and slid open the screen. The figure then carefully stepped into the room, its bare feet not even making a sound on the carpet. Trevor watched as it lurched forward, suddenly aware of the odd smell in the room. It was a musty, mold-like smell, like rotting leaves, the type of smell you would associate with something that lives deep in the forest. He guessed that the smell was coming from the tattered rags the thing was wearing. Equally bizarre was the twinkling sound it made when it moved, which Trevor realized was from the strange beads it wore around his wrists and neck. The creature turned away from the window and towards his bed, and as it did he saw its face illuminated in the silvery moonlight. It didn't look human, more like a pale gray latex mask that had been pulled tightly over someone's head. The eyes were sunken in very deeply, like two pinpricks of light inside deep, dark pits. The nose was barely perceptible, just a flat, shapeless lump with two dots for nostrils. What terrified him the most, though, was the mouth, which was lipless slit across a face that stretched from ear to ear. The thing paused, clearly aware that Trevor was looking at it. That was when it grinned at him, its gigantic teeth gleaming in the moonlight. They weren't serrated or anything like that, but like a person's, the only difference being their size. The thing's front teeth had to be an inch and a half long. After leering at him with its Cheshire cat-like grin, it raised a bony finger to where its lips should have been. "Shh," it said. Trevor couldn't respond, couldn't even move as it glided towards his bed. It was now standing over him, its grin having returned. Its yellow eyes locked on his and he felt himself wet the bed. It moved its thin, spidery hands towards him, and that was when Trevor was sure he was going to die. He squeezed his eyes shut, not wanting to see when it tore his guts out. Trevor waited a few moments, but nothing happened. He felt movement from behind him and slowly cracked open his eyes. The thing had reached around his head and now had its long, skinny arm under his pillow. He watched in confusion as it rooted around beneath his pillow until it seemed to find what it was looking for. When it withdrew its hand, Trevor could see his baby tooth clutched between its tweezer-like fingers. It made a strange chirping sound as it held the tooth to the light, inspecting it the way an appraiser would an expensive jewel. Its grin only seemed to widen as it slipped the tooth between the folds of its tattered robes, apparently pleased with itself. Trevor was watching in a mix of horror and disbelief when he noticed what the strange beads it was wearing really were. It had dozens of strands made out of human teeth. The being then reached into his robes and withdrew a crumpled, dirty-looking dollar bill and slipped it under Trevor's pillow. It paused, then reached out its skeletal hand and patted Trevor on the head gingerly, making a soft cooing sound as it did. It then turned back to the window, gliding silently across the floor. It crawled back through the screen, leaping soundlessly to the ground like a cat. The window then slowly closed and latched itself, followed by the fan turning back on. The nightlight in the corner slowly flickered back to life as Trevor watched the streetlights turn back on one by one. Within a few moments he heard the crickets return, resuming their singing like nothing had happened. Trevor was far too shocked to sleep and sat bolt upright in bed watching the window. He remained like that for hours, not even moving an inch. Mark woke up around 9 that morning, having had too much to drink the night before. He held his head in pain, fumbling for the remote so that he could switch off the TV. All he had on was an undershirt and a pair of boxers, so he felt his way across the floor with his other hand until he found his jeans. He went into the kitchen to start a pot of coffee, and then decided to get Trevor up. It was the weekend, but even still he probably shouldn't let him sleep too long. He made his way upstairs and opened Trevor's door, expecting to find him asleep. He was surprised to see his son sitting up in bed, a blank expression on his face as he stared at the window. "What's the matter, sport?" Mark asked. Suddenly he remembered something and put his palm to his face. "Aw, buddy, I'm sorry. Did the Tooth Fairy forget you?" Trevor didn't answer for a moment, still staring at the window. "No," he finally muttered. "It came." Mark looked down, confused, and then walked over to the bed. He reached under his son's pillow and retrieved a rather dirty-looking dollar bill, which looked like it had been pulled right out of a trash can. "Oh!" Mark exclaimed. That's great." He looked at the dollar bill confused, and then put it on the bedside table. "Why don't you get dressed and come downstairs? I'll make breakfast." Trevor nodded wordlessly as his father left the room. "Huh," Mark said thoughtfully as he walked down the stairs. "I guess I did remember." I want to thank you guys so much for listening to this. Please check out my other YouTube channel, How to Draw Creepy Creatures, also under the name Arthur Short. I want to wish all of you guys a early happy Halloween. So I'm going to be doing more stories like this. If you have any questions or comments about the show or suggestions for future topics, please leave it in the comments. And I will see you guys next time. Okay, bye.